What if your only job was to produce a male heir, but you kept having daughters? What if the king, your husband, had more than 20 illegitimate children, but you couldn't produce one legitimate son? What if your entire value was tied to a body that could betray you at any moment? What if your crown, your safety, and your country's future depended on you surviving childbirth, a process that could easily kill you? This was life for a Norman queen in England. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a brutal business. Number 21, how heavy was the crown? The crown itself weighed between 3 and 4 pounds. A queen consort's crown, like the one likely worn by Matilda of Flanders, was often lighter than the king's St. Edward's crown, but still a significant weight. The Bayeux Tapestry, commissioned by Bishop Odo around 1077, does not depict Matilda's coronation, an event which took place in May 1068. This omission is telling, focusing the narrative entirely on the male conquest. Your coronation wasn't a celebration of you. It was a confirmation of your husband's power. It was a public statement. This woman is the king's wife. Her children will be legitimate heirs. That was your primary function, sealed with a ceremony. The anointing with holy oil was a deeply significant part of the ritual. It set you apart. It made you sacred in the eyes of the church and the people. But this sacred status was conditional. It depended entirely on your connection to the king. The weight wasn't just physical. It was the crushing burden of expectation. You were the mother of the nation, or you were supposed to be. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a public failure. Every daughter born was a disappointment, a sign that God had perhaps not fully blessed the union. Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, was named heir to the English throne in 1127. The barons were forced to swear an oath to support her, something almost unheard of. It showed how desperate the situation was. A woman ruling in her own right was a radical, terrifying idea to the Norman aristocracy. Her entire life was a battle against the perception that a woman was unfit to bear that symbolic weight. Think about the crown as a contract. You wore it, and in return, you were expected to provide stability. You did this by producing a son. Matilda of Scotland, Henry I's first wife, was a good queen by this measure. She gave him a son, William Adelin, and a daughter, the future Empress Matilda. She fulfilled her part of the contract. The relief at court must have been immense. But then the weight shifted. Now you had to ensure the son survived to adulthood. Every cough, every fever was a potential dynastic crisis. The crown also made you a target. You were the living symbol of a political alliance. If that alliance faltered, your position became precarious. When your husband died, the crown's protection could vanish in an instant. You could become a pawn in the next power struggle. Adeliza of Louvain, Henry I's second wife, was beautiful and young, married to an aging king specifically to produce a spare heir after William Adelin's death in 1120. She failed. For the 7 years of her marriage to Henry, she remained childless. Every day, the symbolic weight of the crown must have felt heavier, a reminder of her failure to fulfill the one task she was chosen for. After Henry's death, she was a dowager queen, a landowner with status, but her central purpose was gone. She remarried to William d'Aubigny and had many children with him. The problem was never her. It was the specific, crushing expectation of her role as queen. The crown wasn't a prize, it was a job with one key performance indicator, a male heir, and failure was not an option. Number 20, would you ever feel at home? Almost every Norman queen was a foreigner. Matilda of Flanders was Flemish. Matilda of Scotland, though born in Scotland, had a deep English, Anglo-Saxon royal lineage, which was a key part of her political value. Adeliza of Louvain came from what is now Belgium. This was not a coincidence. Marriage was international diplomacy. You were a treaty sealed in flesh and blood. You arrived in a new country, often as a teenager, to marry a man you had likely never met. You didn't speak the language of the common people, which was a form of early English. You spoke Norman French, the language of the court. But even the court was a viper's nest of established relationships and rivalries. You were the outsider. Matilda of Flanders, wife of William the Conqueror, spent the vast majority of her time in Normandy, governing the duchy while William was in his new kingdom of England. England was his prize, but Normandy was their home base. She may have been Queen of England, but she was Duchess of Normandy first. Her visits to England were rare and for specific state occasions, like her coronation in 1068. She wasn't there to integrate or to become English. She was there to represent the Norman power structure. She was a ruler, but a foreign one. Matilda of Scotland was different. Her mother was Saint Margaret of Scotland, who was herself a princess of the old English royal house of Wessex. Well, Henry, I married her in 1100 precisely for this reason. It was a brilliant political move. He was a Norman king, a conqueror's son, and his grip on the throne was not entirely secure. By marrying a woman with Anglo-Saxon royal blood, he was uniting the two lines. He was symbolically healing the wounds of the conquest of 1066. Her children would be both Norman and English, but this didn't mean she felt at home. The Norman barons were suspicious of her. They nicknamed her and Henry Godric and Godjifu old-fashioned English names as a form of mockery. They saw her as a representative of the conquered people. Even as she sat on the throne, she had to navigate this tension her entire life. She founded hospitals and priories, engaged in pious works, and built bridges, literally, to win over her new people. She was always working to justify her place. For Adeliza of Louvain, her foreignness was less politically charged, but still isolating. She was known as the Fair Maid of Brabant. Her value was her youth, her beauty, and her potential fertility. She came to a court that was already established, to a husband who was decades older than her, and grieving his only legitimate son. The court would have been polite, but she was an outsider trying to fit into a system built around her predecessor. She was a replacement, and she failed to provide the required heir. How could she ever feel at home when her entire existence there was based on a single function she couldn't fulfill? After Henry's death, she held her lands as a dowager queen, but she was no longer at the center of power. Her marriage to a powerful English baron, William d'Aubigny, finally rooted her in the English aristocracy. But this was a life she made for herself after her role as queen was over. Being queen meant being a foreigner, a permanent guest whose welcome could be revoked at any time. Number 19 was God Your Only Ally. A queen was expected to be pious. This was not just a matter of personal faith. It was a crucial part of her public role. Her piety reflected on her husband, the king. It showed that the kingdom was righteous and blessed by God. Your every public act of worship was a piece of political theater. The chronicles of the time, written by monks, paid close attention to the religious devotion of royal women. A queen who founded a monastery was a good queen. A queen who prayed for the soul of the king was a good queen. Matilda of Flanders founded the Abayos Dam in Caen, a magnificent convent, as an act of penance. The Pope had initially opposed her marriage to William the Conqueror on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related. The founding of her abbey, and William's Abbaye Auxerre, was part of the deal to get the papal dispensation they needed. Her faith was intertwined with political necessity. The convent also served as a safe and respectable place for her daughters to be educated and, in some cases, to live out their lives. It was a strategic asset as much as a spiritual one. Matilda of Scotland was renowned for her piety, so much so that she was sometimes called Good Queen Maud. She was raised in a convent before her marriage. The stories told about her emphasize her devotion. She would allegedly wash the feet of the poor and tend to the sick herself. This was a powerful image. It presented the Norman monarchy, still seen as a harsh foreign power, as compassionate and godly. Her piety was a tool for building bridges with her Anglo-Saxon subjects, connecting her to a tradition of saintly English queens. She commissioned the translation of saints' lives and was a patron of music and literature. Her faith was genuine, but it also had a clear political function. It softened the image of the Norman regime. For a queen, the church was one of the few spheres where she could exercise direct power and influence. While she couldn't lead an army, she could be a patron of a great abbey. She could influence the appointments of bishops and abbots. This gave her a network of powerful men who were loyal to her. In a court full of shifting allegiances, a powerful churchman could be a vital ally. He could be your confidant, your advisor, and your advocate, but this reliance on God and the church also highlighted a queen's fundamental vulnerability. When politics failed, when your husband was angry, when your children were sick, prayer was your main recourse. When Empress Matilda was trapped in Oxford Castle in the winter of 1142, surrounded by the forces of her cousin King Stephen, she was powerless. According to the chronicles, she escaped across the frozen River Thames in a white cloak to blend in with the snow. It was an act of desperate courage. But in the years leading up to that, and in the years after, as her fight for the throne faltered, her main source of strength would have been her belief that God was on her side, that her cause was just. In a world where your fate was determined by battles and male inheritance laws, God was often the only ally who seemed to be listening. Number 18, did you rule or were you ruled? The official answer was simple: you were ruled. You were the queen consort, not the queen regnant. Your power was derived entirely from your husband, the king. Your official title was Regina, queen, but your role was to be his wife and the mother of his children. You did not have a constitutional right to rule, and yet the reality was far more complex. A capable queen could wield immense influence. Matilda of Flanders was a prime example. William the Conqueror trusted her implicitly. While he was in England, securing his new kingdom after 1066, he left her in charge of Normandy. She was his regent. She governed the duchy for long periods, issuing charters, presiding over the courts, and managing its defense. This was not a ceremonial role. She was the effective ruler of one of the most powerful and turbulent territories in Europe. Her name appears alongside William's unofficial documents. She was his partner in power, but this power was delegated. It was his authority she was exercising, and it could be withdrawn at any time. When their eldest son, Robert Curthose, rebelled against his father, Matilda secretly sent him money. When William found out, he was furious. It was a stark reminder that her loyalty was expected to be to him, the king, above even her own son. Empress Matilda's life was a direct confrontation with this question. She was not a queen consort. She was named her father's heir. The barons swore to support her claim, but when Henry I died in 1135, her cousin Stephen of Blois rushed to England and seized the throne. What followed was the civil war known as the Anarchy. Empress Matilda fought for her inheritance for years. She led armies, negotiated with barons, and at one point in 1141 she was even declared Lady of the English and briefly controlled London. But she was never crowned queen. The chronicles portray her as arrogant and high-handed. Whether this is true or a reflection of the sexism of the time is hard to say, but it shows the immense resistance to the idea of a woman ruling in her own right. She had the bloodline, she had the claim, but she could not overcome the fundamental belief that a man should wear the crown. In the end, she gave up her own claim in favor of her son, who would become King Henry II. She had to channel her power through a male figure. Even a more traditional queen like Matilda of Boulogne, King Stephen's wife, showed the potential for a queen to act decisively. While Stephen was a captive of the Empress's forces in 1141, it was his queen, Matilda, who rallied his supporters. She raised an army, secured the loyalty of London, and ultimately managed to capture the Empress's most important ally. This led to a prisoner exchange, and Stephen was freed. She was a formidable military and political leader in her own right. But she was acting in her husband's name. Her goal was to put him back on the throne, not to sit on it herself. Her power was a temporary emergency measure. You could be a regent, a commander, a diplomat. You could be the power behind the throne. But the throne itself was not meant for you. You were a vessel for power, not its source. Number 17, how was your story told by others? You had no control over your own narrative. Your life was recorded by men, almost exclusively monks, writing in Latin. Their job was not to provide an objective account of your life. It was to record the history of the kingdom, the deeds of great men, and the workings of God's will. You were a secondary character in someone else's story, and how you were portrayed depended entirely on whether you fit their idea of a good queen. A good queen was pious, fertile with sons, and obedient to her husband. Matilda of Scotland is the perfect example. The chroniclers loved her. William of Malmesbury and Orderic Vitalis praise her charity, her devotion to the church, and her role in linking the Norman and Anglo-Saxon royal lines. She was good Queen Maud. She played her part perfectly, and her story was told as a model of female virtue. She was a saintly figure who supported her husband and the kingdom. This was the ideal narrative. A bad queen, on the other hand, was one who stepped outside these boundaries. Empress Matilda is the classic case. As a woman who claimed the right to rule, she was a threat to the natural order. The chroniclers who supported her rival, Stephen, portray her as arrogant, demanding, and unfeminine. The Gesta Stephani, a chronicle highly favorable to Stephen, describes how she alienated the citizens of London with her intolerable arrogance just before her planned coronation. She demanded a large tax, and they drove her from the city. Is this an accurate answer count of her personality? Or is it propaganda, a way of justifying the rejection of a female ruler? It's impossible to know for sure. But it shows how your reputation was in the hands of your political enemies. She was a woman who sought power, so her story was written to show that women were unsuited for power. Even your appearance was a matter for public commentary. Adeliza of Louvain was celebrated for her beauty. The chroniclers mention it frequently. This was a positive attribute for a queen. It reflected well on the king and his court. But it also reduced her to an ornament. Her primary role upon her arrival in England was to be beautiful and hopefully fertile. Her intelligence, her character, her feelings, these were rarely mentioned. She was the fair maid of Brabant. That was her label. The stories that survive are often moral tales. When William the Conqueror's son Richard was killed in a hunting accident in the New Forest, and his other son, King William II, was killed in the same forest years later, chroniclers saw it as God's punishment. They claimed William I had unjustly cleared villages to create his royal hunting ground. His family's tragedies were woven into a narrative about divine justice. Your personal grief was not your own. It was a public lesson. You had no private life. Your every action, from founding a church to arguing with your husband, could be recorded, interpreted, and twisted to fit a political or moral narrative you had no power to shape. You were a character in a history written by others, for others. Number 16. What did you do all day? The life of a queen was not one of idle luxury. It was a demanding job, governed by routine and responsibility. Your day was structured around religious services, political meetings, and the management of a vast household. Privacy was a concept that barely existed. You were always surrounded by ladies in waiting, chaplains, clerks, and petitioners. Your morning would begin with prayer. The queen had her own chapel and chaplains. Religious observance was not just a private matter, it was a public duty. After Mass, you would break your fast. The food was rich for the time, but subject to the seasons. Bread, wine, or ale, and some form of meat or fish would be standard. Then the business of the day began. A huge part of your role was managing the queen's household. This was a massive enterprise, a court within the court. It included dozens, if not hundreds, of people. You had to oversee the finances, the supplies, the staff. You were also responsible for the upbringing of your children, especially your daughters, and often the children of other great nobles who were sent to court to be educated. This was a way of building alliances and ensuring the loyalty of the next generation of the aristocracy. You were also a businesswoman. A Norman queen was entitled to queen's gold, a surcharge on certain fines paid to the king. It was a source of independent income. You also controlled your own dower lands, the properties granted to you upon your marriage. You were expected to manage these estates, to make them profitable, and to use the income to support your household and your charitable works. Matilda of Flanders was known to be a capable manager of her lands, both in Normandy and England. This required a significant degree of literacy and numeracy, or at least the ability to command clerks and officials who had those skills. Much of your day would be spent in the public eye. You would sit with the king in his court, the courier reges, listening to legal disputes and petitions. Your presence lent authority to the proceedings. People would come to you directly, seeking your intercession with the king. You were seen as a softer, more approachable route to power. A word from the queen in the king's ear could secure a land grant, a favorable judgment, or a pardon. This role as an intercessor was one of the key sources of a queen's informal power. There was time for leisure, but it was often public as well. This hunting with hawks rather than bows was a popular pastime for noblewomen. You would listen to music, play games like chess, and do embroidery. The Bayeux Tapestry, a massive embroidered cloth telling the story of the Norman conquest, is a famous example of the kind of needlework noblewomen undertook, though it was likely made by professional embroiderers under a noble patron's direction, possibly Queen Matilda's. Even your leisure activities were a display of culture and status. Your day was a performance, from the moment you woke until the moment you retired, to a bedchamber that was likely shared with several trusted attendants. It was a life of constant duty with very little personal freedom. Number 15, could you trust anyone at court? The Norman court was a dangerous place. It was the center of power, and everyone there was competing for it. They wanted land, titles, influence, and the king's favor. As queen, you were at the very heart of this web of ambition and intrigue. Trust was a rare and precious commodity. Your own household was your first line of defense. Your ladies-in-waiting, your chaplains, your clerks, these were the people you saw every day. You would try to, appoint people you knew, perhaps from your own family or home country. Adeliza of Louvain brought members of her own retinue from Brabant when she came to England. This gave her a core group of people whose first loyalty was to her, but even they could be tempted by bribes or threats from rival factions. The king's family was a constant source of danger. Brothers, uncles, and cousins of the king often had their own claims to the throne or ambitions for their children. The civil war between Empress Matilda and her cousin Stephen is the most dramatic example of this. They were both grandchildren of William the Conqueror. Their family tie meant nothing when the crown was at stake. The entire aristocracy was forced to choose sides. Friendships and family loyalties were torn apart. The king's illegitimate children were another complication. And Henry, I famously had over 20 illegitimate children. While they could not inherit the throne, they were a significant presence at court. He married his illegitimate daughters to powerful nobles and gave his illegitimate sons lands and titles. They formed a powerful block of support for the king, but they could also be a source of rivalry and tension with the queen's legitimate children. As queen, you had to navigate your relationship with this extended family carefully. They were a reminder of your husband's life outside your marriage, and their ambitions could easily clash with your own. Even your own children could not always be trusted. The relationship between William the Conqueror, Queen Matilda, and their eldest son, Robert Curthose, was famously stormy. Robert was in open rebellion against his father for years. As mentioned, Matilda was caught in the middle, secretly supporting her son against her husband. This was a terrible position to be in, a choice between the two most important men in her life. It shows how even the most intimate family relationships were strained by the pressures of power and inheritance. The barons and bishops were the other key players. They were powerful men with their own armies and vast estates. Their loyalty was essential to the stability of the kingdom, but it was often conditional. They would support the king as long as it served their interests. A queen had to cultivate her own relationships with these powerful figures. She could act as a patron, granting them favors and seeking their counsel. Matilda of Scotland was skilled at this, building a network of loyal churchmen. But you could never be sure where their ultimate loyalty lay. In a crisis, they might abandon you for a rival with a better offer. At court, you were constantly being watched. Every word you said, every friendship you made was analyzed for its political meaning. It was a life of permanent suspicion. Number 14, what was it like to be married to the king? Your marriage was not a romance. It was a political merger. You were chosen for your bloodline, your connections, and your childbearing potential. Love was not a factor in the negotiation. Affection might grow over time, but the foundation of the relationship was dynastic strategy. The king was not just your husband. He was your lord. You owed him obedience, legally and socially. His will was paramount. William the Conqueror's marriage to Matilda of Flanders was a partnership, but he was unquestionably the senior partner. He was a formidable, often brutal, warlord. While he trusted her with the governance of Normandy, he would not tolerate any challenge to his authority, even from her. The king's infidelity was a reality you simply had to accept. It was common for kings to have mistresses and illegitimate children. This was not seen as a moral failing in the same way a queen's infidelity would have been. A queen's adultery was treason, as it could cast doubt on the legitimacy of the royal succession. A king's affairs were a private matter that often had public consequences, as with Henry, the first huge brood of illegitimate offspring. As queen, you were expected to tolerate this. It was part of the double standard of the age. Your role was to provide the legitimate heir, not to be the sole object of your husband's affection. The king was often absent. Norman kings were constantly on the move, touring their kingdom, putting down rebellions, or fighting wars in France. William the Conqueror spent more time in Normandy than in England after the initial conquest. Henry was also frequently in his continental territories. This meant you could spend months or even years apart from your husband. During these times, you might act as regent, holding power in his name. But it could also be a lonely and uncertain existence. You were governing in the name of a man who was hundreds of miles away, facing his own dangers. News traveled slowly and unreliably. You could wait for weeks to hear the outcome of a crucial battle. There were, however, signs of genuine affection in some of these relationships. William the Conqueror was said to be devastated by Matilda's death in 1083. He reportedly wept at her funeral and was never the same again. After years of a shared struggle for power and raising a large family, a deep bond had clearly formed. Henry also seems to have had real affection for his first wife, Matilda of Scotland. He was with her when she died in 1118 and mourned her deeply. He founded a priory in her memory. But the fundamental power imbalance was always there. The king held your life and position in his hands. When Henry, I's only legitimate son, William Adelin, died in the White Ship disaster of 1120, the king's grief was personal, but it was also a dynastic catastrophe. His entire strategy for the succession was destroyed. His second marriage to the young Adeliza of Louvain was a cold, calculated attempt to solve this political problem. For Adeliza, marriage to the king meant being wedded to a grieving older man who desperately needed a son. The personal feelings of the people involved were secondary to the needs of the state. Number 13, did your wealth ever truly belong to you? As a Norman queen, you were not poor. You controlled significant wealth and resources, but the concept of personal ownership was very different from today. Your wealth was tied to your role, and it could be as insecure as your position at court. Your primary sources of income were your dower and the queen's gold. The dower was a portfolio of lands and property settled on you at the time of your marriage. This was meant to provide for you throughout your life, and especially in your widowhood. The lands were yours to manage. You collected the rents, appointed the officials, and enjoyed the profits. Matilda of Flanders, for example, held vast estates in both England and Normandy. The Domesday Book of 1086 records lands belonging to her, showing the scale of her holdings. This made you a major landowner, a powerful figure in your own right. Queen's gold, or aurum reginae, was a more unusual source of income. It was a supplementary payment, traditionally 1/10 of the value of any voluntary fine paid to the king. If a baron paid the king 100 marks of silver for a royal favor, you were entitled to an extra 10 marks. This was your right. It gave you a stream of cash income that was independent of your lands. Adeliza of Louvain was particularly noted for her careful management and collection of queen's gold. You used this wealth to run your household, which was a huge expense. You also used it for patronage. A queen was expected to be charitable. Matilda of Scotland was famous for founding Holy Trinity Priory in London and a leper hospital. This was not just about piety, it was about building a reputation and a network of support. Your patronage of a monastery meant the monks there would pray for you, and they would also write favorably about you in their chronicles. It was an investment in your legacy, but did this wealth truly belong to you? Not in the modern sense. It was yours because you were the queen. If your husband died and a new king came to the throne, your situation could change dramatically. As a dowager queen, you were entitled to your dower lands for life, but a hostile new king could challenge your rights, seize your lands, or make your life difficult. When Empress Matilda was fighting Stephen for the throne, control of land was central to the conflict. Your lands were seized and granted to supporters on both sides. Ownership was only as secure as your political power. Your wealth was also a tool of the king. He could ask you to contribute to his projects, such as funding a war or a major building project. It would be very difficult to refuse such a request. Your money was ultimately part of the royal finances, even if it was administered separately. It was a resource for the crown, and the king was the crown. You were a steward of great wealth, a manager of a large portfolio, but the ultimate owner was the dynasty you had married into. Number 12, could you survive giving birth? For any woman in the 11th and 12th centuries, childbirth was a life-threatening event. For a queen, it was the most dangerous and most important part of her job. The entire future of the dynasty rested on her ability to produce a healthy male heir and survive the process. The pressure was unimaginable. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. There was no understanding of germs or infection. Midwives attended the birth, relying on traditional knowledge passed down through generations. The delivery itself was fraught with danger. A difficult or prolonged labor or a baby in the wrong position could be a death sentence for both mother and child. Postpartum infection, known as childbed fever, was a common killer. With no antibiotics, a simple infection could quickly become fatal. It's estimated that maternal mortality rates were incredibly high, perhaps as high as 1 in 3, over the course of a woman's childbearing years. You would have known many women sisters, cousins, ladies-in-waiting who had died in childbirth. A queen gave birth in a very public way. The event was not private. The birthing chamber would be filled with women, and high-ranking nobles and churchmen would be waiting nearby. This was to ensure there was no question about the legitimacy of the child. There could be no rumors of a baby being switched. The birth of a royal heir was a state event, and your most intimate and painful moments were subject to public scrutiny. Matilda of Flanders was a remarkably successful mother by the standards of the age. She had at least 9 children who survived to adulthood, including 4 sons. This was an extraordinary achievement and a key reason for the stability of William's rule. She fulfilled her primary duty many times over. But she would have endured at least 9 dangerous confinements, each one a roll of the dice. Contrast this with Adeliza of Louvain. She was married to Henry I for the express purpose of having a son. For 7 years she failed to conceive. We can only imagine the monthly anxiety and public disappointment. The problem was likely Henry's age, but the blame and the pressure would have fallen on her. After Henry's death, she remarried and had 7 children, with her second husband proving her fertility. But during her time as queen, she was defined by her empty womb. Empress Matilda also faced the dangers of childbirth. She had 3 sons with her second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. Her first son, the future King Henry II of England, was born in 1133. This birth was crucial. It gave her a male heir to carry on her claim to the English throne. But each pregnancy was a risk, and it took place against the backdrop of political instability and looming civil war. Even if you and the baby survived the birth, the first few years of a child's life were perilous. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. And diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and measles, which we now vaccinate against, were common killers. It's estimated that up to a third of children died before the age of 5. Queens were not immune to this grief. They may have had the best food and care available, but they could not protect their children from the realities of medieval life. To be a queen was to live with the constant, intimate reality of death, both your own and that of your children. Number 11, how many children would you bury? The grief of losing a child was a common thread in the lives of all medieval women, from the peasant to the queen. But for a queen, this personal tragedy was also a dynastic disaster. The death of an heir could plunge the kingdom into chaos. Even William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders, who were so successful in producing children, suffered loss. They had several daughters, and the exact number is debated by historians, suggesting some may have died in infancy or childhood and were poorly recorded. One daughter, Agatha, was betrothed to a Spanish king, but died on the way to her wedding. Another, Constance, died, possibly of poison, after marrying the Duke of Brittany. As a mother, Matilda had to send her children across Europe for political marriages, often never seeing them again, and living with the constant fear of news of their death. The most famous and devastating example of child loss for the Norman dynasty was the death of William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I and Matilda of Scotland. In 1120, William then about 17 years old, was returning from Normandy to England. His ship, the White Ship, hit a rock and sank in the English Channel. Almost everyone on board drowned. The chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, wrote that Henry, "I never smiled again after hearing the news." This single event changed the course of English history. It destroyed Henry's careful plans for a peaceful succession. His first wife, Matilda, had died 2 years earlier, so she was spared this particular grief. But Henry's desperate attempts to secure the throne for his daughter, the Empress Matilda, and his second marriage to Adeliza of Leuven were all direct consequences of that one night. The death of that one boy led to nearly 2 decades of civil war. Empress Matilda also experienced the fear of losing her children. Her struggle for the throne was not just for herself, it was for her son Henry. During the years of the anarchy, her young son was her greatest asset, the living embodiment of her claim. He was moved between Normandy and England for his safety. She had to endure long separations from him, entrusting his safety and upbringing to others while she fought her war. The constant threat of battle, of capture, of illness must have been a terrifying burden. The high rate of infant mortality meant that you could have 10 pregnancies and only see 3 or 4 children reach adulthood. You would name a child, love them, and then watch them die from a fever or a sickness for which there was no cure. You would be expected to get pregnant again as soon as possible to try again to produce the necessary heirs. Grief was a constant companion, but it was a luxury you could not afford to indulge in for long. The needs of the dynasty always came first. Your womb was a battlefield, and every child lost was a battle lost. Number 10 was knowledge a weapon or a weakness. For a Norman queen, literacy was a significant advantage. Most high-born women were taught to read, primarily religious texts in Latin. This was considered a necessary part of a pious and cultured upbringing. The ability to read the Bible and the lives of the saints was a sign of status and refinement. But for a queen, knowledge, especially literacy, could be much more than that. It could be a tool of power. Matilda of Scotland was highly educated. She had spent much of her youth in the convents of Romsey and Wilton. She was not only literate in Latin, but was also a great patron of literature and music. She corresponded with leading churchmen of the day, like Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury. Her letters show an intelligent and engaged mind. This education gave her credibility. It allowed her to participate in the high-level intellectual and religious debates of her time. It also enabled her to manage her estates and her finances effectively, reading charters and account books herself, rather than relying solely on her clerks. Her knowledge was a weapon. It allowed her to be an active and influential queen. Empress Matilda was also highly educated. She had spent her formative years in Germany as the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. She would have been exposed to one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. She could read and likely spoke several languages. This background gave her the confidence and the administrative skills to press her claim to the English throne. She issued her own charters and commanded her own officials. Her enemies may have criticized her as arrogant, but no one ever accused her of being stupid. Her knowledge was the foundation of her campaign to rule. However, a woman who was too learned or too clever could be seen as unnatural or dangerous. The world was patriarchal. A woman's role was to be a wife and mother, not a scholar or a ruler. A queen who displayed her intelligence too openly risked being seen as masculine and overstepping her bounds. This is part of the criticism leveled at Empress Matilda. Her sharp mind and refusal to be a passive pawn were perceived as arrogance. Her knowledge in the eyes of her enemies was a weakness because it made her unfeminine and unsuited to the proper role of a woman. The type of knowledge you had mattered. Practical knowledge of estate management, genealogy, and the law was useful. An understanding of theology and philosophy was admirable as long as it was used in the service of piety. But an open display of strategic or political knowledge could be threatening. A queen had to be smart enough to manage her affairs and advise her husband, but not so smart that she appeared to be telling him what to do. It was a delicate balance. Knowledge was a powerful asset, but it had to be wielded with care, often from behind the scenes, so as not to challenge the male-dominated power structure of the court. Number 9, what sickness would kill you? In the Norman period, life was a daily struggle against a host of diseases and ailments for which there was no effective cure. Even for a queen, living in the best possible conditions, the threat of a fatal illness was constant. Your wealth could buy you better food and a stone castle instead of a wooden hut, but it couldn't protect you from the fundamental realities of medieval medicine. Infectious diseases were rampant. A simple cut or a wound could lead to a deadly infection. With no concept of sanitation or antibiotics, there was little to be done. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was a common killer spread through contaminated food and water. Typhoid fever was another. The great seasonal epidemics of diseases like smallpox or measles could sweep through the population, and the court was not immune. The close quarters of a royal household, with hundreds of people living together, could be a breeding ground for disease. The general state of health was poor by modern standards. Diets lacked key vitamins, leading to conditions like scurvy. Dental health was atrocious, and a tooth abscess could lead to a fatal systemic infection. Chronic pain from arthritis and other ailments was a part of daily life. The cause of death for most Norman queens is not recorded with any medical precision in the chronicles. They simply fell ill and died. Matilda of Flanders died in 1083 at the age of about 52, a respectable age for the time. Her final illness is not specified. Matilda of Scotland died in 1118, aged around 38. Again, the cause is unknown. It could have been anything from a lingering postpartum infection to pneumonia or tuberculosis. Childbirth, as discussed, was one of the most significant specific dangers, but the cumulative toll of multiple pregnancies and births also weakened a woman's body, making her more susceptible to other illnesses. Medical treatment was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. Treatments aimed to restore the balance through methods like bloodletting, purging, and specific diets. These treatments were often more harmful than helpful. A doctor might bleed a patient who was already weak from illness, further hastening their death. Herbal remedies were also widely used. Some may have had some benefit, but many were ineffective or based on superstition. A queen would have had access to the best physicians of the day, but these physicians were working with a complete lack of scientific understanding of the human body and disease. When a queen fell ill, her fate was largely in the hands of God and her own constitution. Prayer, not medicine, was seen as the most powerful remedy. You would die of a disease that today would be cured with a simple course of antibiotics or a minor surgical procedure. The world was full of invisible threats that no amount of power or wealth could protect you from. Number 8, who were your real rivals? Your most dangerous rivals were not always the ones on a battlefield. As a queen, you were in a constant, subtle competition for status, influence, and security. And your rivals were often other women. The king's mistresses were an obvious source of rivalry. While you were expected to tolerate their existence, a mistress who gained too much influence over the king could be a serious threat. She might try to secure titles and lands for her illegitimate children, potentially at the expense of your own. The presence of these women was a constant reminder of the limits of your own position. You had the status and the legitimacy, but they might have the king's genuine affection and his ear. Your mother-in-law could also be a formidable rival, especially if she was a powerful dowager queen. She would have her own established network of allies at court, her own lands, and her own ideas about how the kingdom should be run. A young new queen had to navigate this relationship with extreme care. You were the newcomer, stepping into a role she had once held. The potential for jealousy and conflict was immense. Your own daughters-in-law would eventually become your rivals. As your sons grew up and married, you would have to cede your position as the primary female figure at court to a new generation. The wife of the heir to the throne in particular would be a rising star. This natural generational shift could be a source of great tension. But perhaps the most intense rivalry was between two women with competing claims to the throne itself. The entire period of the anarchy was defined by the rivalry between two women, Empress Matilda and Matilda of Boulogne. They were cousins by marriage, fighting for the crown on behalf of themselves and their husbands. Empress Matilda fought for her own inheritance, and Matilda of Boulogne fought for her husband Stephen. They were the two poles of power around which the Civil War revolved. They commanded armies, rallied supporters, and negotiated truces. For years, the fate of England was in the hands of these two rival Matildas. This was not a subtle courtly intrigue, it was an open war between two women and their factions. This highlights the core of female rivalry at court. It was almost always about proximity to male power. Who was the rightful mother of the future king? Who had the most influence over the current king? Whose husband or son would ultimately wear the crown? You were not competing for power for yourself, but for the men through whom you derived your status. The exception, of course, was Empress Matilda, who fought for her own right to rule, and her struggle shows just how violently the system resisted a woman who refused to play by those rules. Number 7, could you endure a life on the move? The Norman court was not static. It did not have a fixed capital like modern London or Paris. The king and his entire household were constantly on the move, in a practice known as the itinerary. This was a political and economic necessity. Politically, the king needed to be seen by his subjects. He traveled from one region to another, holding court, administering justice, and reminding the powerful local lords who was in charge. His physical presence was a projection of power. As queen, you would be part of this traveling circus. Economically, it was the only way to support the massive royal household. The court might consist of hundreds, even thousands of people, nobles, knights, clerks, servants, and all their attendants. They would descend on a royal manor or a town and literally eat it out of house and home. They would consume all the stored food and wine, hunt all the game in the surrounding forests, and then, after a few weeks or months, they would have to move on to the next place to do it all over again. Travel conditions were brutal. The Roman road system had fallen into disrepair. Most roads were little more than muddy tracks. A journey of 20 miles could take all day. The court moved at the speed of its slowest baggage wagon. You would travel on horseback or perhaps in a springless, uncomfortable litter if you were pregnant or unwell. You would be exposed to the elements, the rain, the cold, the heat. Accommodation was variable. You might stay in one of the king's castles, which were cold, dark, and drafty fortresses designed for defense, not comfort. Or you might stay in a monastery which offered more peace but basic living quarters. There were no permanent royal palaces in the modern sense. Your home was a collection of chests and furniture that traveled with you. Tapestries were hung on the stone walls of whatever castle you were in to provide some insulation and a touch of color, but they had to be taken down and packed up every time the court moved. This constant movement was disruptive and exhausting. It made a settled family life impossible. Your children were often fostered in other noble households or left in the care of trusted guardians in a secure castle while you were on the road. For the queen, a life on the move was a physical and emotional endurance test. It was a rootless, restless existence, a constant reminder that your position, like your physical location, was never truly settled. Number 6, were you a queen or a chess piece? From the moment you were born a princess, you were a political asset. Your value lay in who you could marry. Your marriage was not a personal choice. It was a move in the great game of European diplomacy. You were a chess piece moved across the board to seal an alliance, end a war, or secure a border. Empress Matilda's life is a perfect illustration of this. At the age of about 8, she was betrothed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, 19th century. She was sent to Germany to be raised in a foreign court. Her marriage secured a powerful alliance for her father, Henry I, against his rivals in France. She was a valuable pawn, connecting the Kingdom of England to the heart of Imperial Europe. When the emperor died, she was still a young woman, but she was now a powerful and prestigious widow. Her father recalled her to England and made her his heir. He then married her off again, this time to Geoffrey of Anjou. This marriage was designed to secure the southern border of Normandy. Matilda and Geoffrey famously disliked each other, but their personal feelings were irrelevant. The match was strategically vital. Her entire life was dictated by the political needs of her father and his kingdom. Your Adeliza of Louvain's marriage was another cold, strategic move. After the death of his son, Henry V needed a new wife to produce a new heir. Adeliza was from a powerful family in a strategic region, and she was young and beautiful. She was chosen from a list of potential candidates like a prize broodmare. Her purpose was singular: to have a son. She was a piece moved onto the board to solve a specific dynastic problem. Even the most successful marriage, like that of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders, began as a strategic calculation. William needed an alliance with the powerful Count of Flanders to secure his position in Normandy. Matilda was the key to that alliance. Their marriage faced papal opposition, but they pushed it through because it was too politically important to abandon. As a chess piece, you had very little agency. Your wishes, your desires, your happiness, these were not part of the equation. You were expected to do your duty, to marry the man chosen for you, and to embrace your new life in a foreign land. The best you could hope for was to make the most of the position you were moved into. A clever queen, like Matilda of Flanders, could turn her role as a chess piece into a position of real power, becoming a player in her own right. But many others were simply sacrificed for the sake of the game. Your life was not your own. It belonged to your family, to the state, and to the man you were forced to call your husband. Number 5, would anyone remember your name? Your legacy was a fragile thing. It depended on two main factors: producing a successful male heir and being remembered favorably by the male chroniclers who wrote the history. If you failed on either of these counts, you risked being forgotten or remembered as a failure. The queens who are best remembered are the ones who were at the center of major historical events. And Matilda of Flanders is remembered because she was the wife of William the Conqueror and the mother of 2 future kings of England. The story of her ordering the Bayeux Tapestry, while likely not true, has linked her name forever with that iconic document. She is remembered as a strong and capable partner to the Conqueror. Matilda of Scotland is remembered as Good Queen Maud. Her legacy was secured by her piety, her charity, and most importantly, her son William Adelin and her daughter Empress Matilda. Her Anglo-Saxon bloodline made her a key figure in the story of the post-conquest settlement. Her name lived on. Empress Matilda is remembered for her dramatic and ultimately unsuccessful fight for the throne. The anarchy is her story. Even though she never ruled as queen, her name is synonymous with that period of English history. Her ultimate legacy was her son, Henry II, who founded the Plantagenet dynasty. She lost her own battle but won the war for her descendants. But what about the others? Adeliza of Louvain is a more marginal figure. She was queen for 7 years, but she produced no heir. She is remembered mainly for her beauty and her failure to solve Henry I's succession crisis. She was a footnote in the story of the anarchy. After Henry's death, she remarried and had a large family, and she was an important patron of the arts. But her royal legacy was minimal. She is the queen who failed. Matilda of Boulogne is also often overshadowed. She was the wife of King Stephen, the rival of the Empress. She was a formidable and effective leader in her own right, instrumental in keeping her husband on the throne. But because history is often written by the victors, and the ultimate victors were the Empress's descendants, Matilda of Boulogne is often portrayed as a secondary character, the consort of a usurper. To be remembered, you had to leave a mark. You could do this through your children, particularly a son who became a successful king. You could do it through patronage by founding a great church or monastery that would carry your name. Or you could do it by being at the center of a great political drama. But if your children died, if your husband's reign was unsuccessful, or if you simply played your part quietly and obediently, you could easily fade from the historical record, your name just one in a long list of royal consorts. Number 4, could you even speak to your people? The Norman conquest of 1066 created a linguistic divide in England that lasted for centuries. The new ruling class, the king, the barons, the high-ranking clergy, all spoke Norman French. The vast majority of the population, the conquered Anglo-Saxons, spoke Old English. These two languages were not mutually intelligible. They were as different as modern French and German. As a Norman queen, you would have lived almost entirely in a French-speaking bubble. The court, your household, your friends, the bishops you talked to, they all spoke French. Your entire world operated in this language. You would have had little reason or opportunity to learn English. It was the language of peasants and servants, a low-status tongue. This created a huge barrier between you and the people you were supposed to be queen of. You could not speak to them directly. When you traveled the country, any interaction with the common folk would have to be done through a translator. You would have seen your subjects, but you would not have understood them. Their concerns, their culture, their stories would have been largely inaccessible to you. Matilda of Scotland was the great exception. Because of her Anglo-Saxon royal heritage, she was almost certainly bilingual. She was raised in England before being sent to Scotland and would have spoken English from childhood. This was a huge part of her value to Henry. She could literally bridge the gap between the Norman rulers and their English subjects. Her ability to speak the language of the people would have been a powerful symbol of unity and would have contributed greatly to her popularity as Good Queen Maud. She was one of them in a way that a Flemish or French queen could never be. For the other queens like Matilda of Flanders or Adeliza of Louvain, this linguistic isolation was a fundamental reality of their lives. It reinforced their status as foreigners. It meant that their understanding of their own kingdom was always filtered through their French-speaking advisors. They could be benevolent rulers, they could be pious patrons, but they could never truly connect with the majority of the population. They ruled over a country whose language they did not share, a constant daily reminder that they were part of a conquering, occupying power, not a natural part of the land they called their kingdom. Number 3, were you ever truly alone? Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist for a medieval queen. Your life was a public performance from morning to night. You were constantly surrounded by an entourage of ladies in waiting, servants, clerks, and guards. Every aspect of your life was witnessed and, to some extent, controlled by others. You did not wake up alone. Your ladies in waiting would sleep in your bedchamber or an adjoining room. They would help you dress, a complicated process involving many layers of clothing. You did not eat alone. Meals were communal events in the Great Hall or in your private chambers with your closest companions. You did not travel alone. You were always part of a large procession. Even the most intimate moments were not private. The consummation of a royal marriage was a matter of state, and while it wasn't witnessed in the way it sometimes was in later centuries, the pressure and expectation were public knowledge. The birth of a child, as noted, was a semi-public event, with witnesses present to verify the legitimacy of the heir. This lack of privacy was partly about security. The king and queen were the most valuable people in the kingdom, and they needed to be protected. But it was also about status. The size of your retinue was a direct reflection of your importance. To be alone was to be insignificant. The queen's household was its own community. Your ladies-in-waiting were not just servants, they were your companions, your confidants, and often your political allies. They were usually high-born women themselves, and their presence around you was a sign of their own family's loyalty and status. You would share your daily life with these women, forming intense bonds of friendship and, sometimes, rivalry. They were your support system, the people you could talk to in your own language in a foreign court. But the constant presence of others meant that you were always on display. Your moods, your health, your relationships, everything was observed and discussed. A harsh word to a lady in waiting could be reported back to her powerful family. A private conversation could be overheard and used for political gossip. You had to maintain a constant state of self-control, a public face of serene and pious queenship, no matter what personal turmoil you were experiencing. The only place you might have found something approaching solitude was in your private chapel during prayer. But even there, your chaplain would likely be nearby. To be a queen was to be a public institution, and an institution is never left alone. Number 2, what was your body worth? Your body was your single most important asset. It was not your own. It belonged to the state, to the dynasty you married into. Its value was calculated with cold political precision. First, your body had value in its bloodline. Your pedigree was a crucial part of your marriage negotiations. Were you the daughter of a king, a duke, a count? How powerful were your relatives? Your blood brought with it alliances, lands, and legitimacy. Matilda of Scotland's body was valuable because it carried the blood of the ancient kings of Wessex. That bloodline helped to legitimize the Norman dynasty and unite a divided kingdom. Second, your body had value in its beauty. A beautiful queen was a credit to her husband and his court. Adeliza of Louvain was known as the Fair Maid of Brabant. Her beauty was an asset, a part of what made her a desirable bride for the aging Henry I. It was a physical manifestation of the prestige of the crown. But this was a superficial value, of fleeting quality that was secondary to the main function of your body. Third, and most importantly, your body's worth was in its fertility. Your womb was a national resource. Its sole purpose in the eyes of the state was to produce a legitimate male heir. This reduced you to a biological function. Your entire standing as queen, your security and your future depended on your ability to conceive and give birth to a son. If you succeeded, like Matilda of Flanders, your position was secure. You had done your job. Your value was confirmed. If you failed, like Adeliza of Louvain during her first marriage, you were a disappointment. Your value plummeted. Every month without a pregnancy was a public mark against you. The pressure on your body was immense. You were expected to endure multiple pregnancies and childbirths with all the associated dangers. Your health was a matter of national concern. Your menstrual cycle was a subject of court gossip and political calculation. Your body was scrutinized, judged, and valued purely for its reproductive capacity. It was the vessel that would carry the future of the kingdom. It was a political tool, a dynastic instrument. It was everything but your own. Number one, did you have a choice? The simple answer is no. From birth to death, the life of a Norman queen was a series of obligations, not choices. You did not choose your husband. You did not choose your country. You did not choose your religion or your political allegiances. These were all decided for you by your father, your brothers, and the man you married. Your marriage was the first and most fundamental choice taken from you. You were a pawn in a diplomatic game, married off as a child or a young teenager to a man you had never met for reasons of state. Your personal feelings were irrelevant. Refusal was not an option. It would be a betrayal of your family and your duty. Once married, your life was governed by the need to produce an heir. You did not have a choice about whether or when to have children. It was your duty, and you were expected to get on with it no matter the risk to your own life. You did not choose your friends at court. You had to associate with the people your husband favored. Your household was appointed for you, a collection of people chosen for their political connections. You had to navigate a world of pre-existing loyalties and enmities. Even your public persona was not your own. You were expected to be the model of a pious, submissive, and fertile queen. If your personality did not fit this mold, you were criticized. Empress Matilda is the ultimate example. She made a choice. She chose to fight for her inheritance. She chose to lead armies and demand to be crowned queen in her own right. She refused to be a passive pawn, and for this, she was punished. She was called arrogant and unfeminine. She lost the throne, and her story was written by men who saw her choice as a violation of the natural order. Her life is a testament to what happened when a royal woman tried to exercise free will. The only real choices available to a Norman queen were small and subtle. You could choose which monastery to patronize. You could choose to be kind to your servants. You could choose to try and build a genuine relationship with your husband and children. Within the rigid cage of your role, you could try to carve out a small space for yourself. And perhaps the most significant choice you had was how you faced your destiny. You could be a passive victim of circumstances, or you could, like Matilda of Flanders, Matilda of Scotland, and both the rival Matildas of the anarchy, take the role you were given and play it with all the intelligence, courage, and determination you possessed. You could not choose the game, but you could choose how you played your hand.